So just to conclude, clearly the study of neoichnology is very much alive. The use of modern traces to help us to understand ancient traces, I think, is a very fun and interesting branch of science to follow. Interpreting the modern traces is great practice for interpreting ancient ones. And there are many modern traces that have not yet been identified in the fossil record. So let's get out there and try and find some of those, particularly things like fish fossils, fish traces, and vertebrate burrows. I think they're terribly underrepresented in the fossil record, and they're just there. We just haven't spotted them yet. So every time you see something in the rock that's tough to explain, remember that it may be a feeding trace, a nest, or even a GRT, a goose resting trace. So really keep an open mind about those. And hopefully every time you see an interesting piece of animal activity, so an animal doing something weird, start thinking about what traces it might be leaving behind. And I'm going to leave you with some examples to whet your appetite to try and find these traces in the fossil record. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll stop. I can see you guys. I'll stop sharing so that we can.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, thank you. I think a round of applause to Jon for that.
It's not me.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Has anybody got something they want to ask now?
I'd like to say thank you, Jon. That was so entertaining, and how much I loved your photos, especially the ones of the snow. And the one that absolutely took my breath away was the owl catching the rabbit. Unbelievable. How did you get that?
They are we go to a bird sanctuary near us quite often, maybe every couple of weeks, and it's amazing the sort of traces we see there. And my daughter is fabulous. She's 11 now, and she is out there scouring for traces all over the place. So yeah, it's harder not to see them than to see them. There's always something to see, and the different style of snow can affect the types of traces that you get as well. So when you have more kind of like frosty conditions, then that's usually better for bird footprints. And when you have the more snowy conditions, then that's better for mammal prints as well. But I've got lots of examples of beaver, coyote, moose, wolf even. So lots of different types of tracks we come across in the field. So yeah, there's a fertile source of, there's lots of wildlife to help out with making these tracks.
Have you found a trace that you haven't been able to explain? An example of that? Because I mean, I know this is very polished talk, Jon, but it seemed that everything that has been found, there's an explanation for, and I'm not sure I quite go with that.
Yeah, so two quick examples. I've got a sort of deer footprint that I found in deep marine sediments in the Triassic, and it looks exactly like a deer footprint, but clearly it can't be. So I'm not quite sure what that is. And then I was explaining to somebody on a field trip yesterday about certain types of dinosaur traces, and I was going into this big story about how we could tell this about the dinosaur and that about the dinosaur, and the guy said, well, you do know that that's all just supposition, don't you? And I said, well, yeah, yes, you're absolutely right. So yes, we can come up with explanations for these, but I think there's any number of weird traces out there. So I should maybe include a slide of kind of like the mystery area, because for every 5 traces that you find that you can assign them, there's probably another 2 or 3 that you can't, or partial traces that could be something that you just don't know what they are.
Right.
I think it's kind of cool that Paleodictyum, that we've found tens of thousands in the fossil record, you know, that hexagonal trace. We found recent examples as well, and yet we still don't know what animal made it. So there's still lots to find out.
Is it worth going on a course with some of these famous trackers and finding out what they know? Because you see them on the television in Africa, and they'll go out and they're looking at the traces on the ground, and they can tell you the whole story of what's been happening. And you think, how do they do that? But they obviously know what they're looking at. And I would think that they could give some very good courses on how to interpret tracks.
Well, yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, really, what fueled this talk that I gave today is that I live in a place where there's lots of traces lying around, you know, modern traces, and yeah, merging the modern and ancient, I think is very important. And sometimes people forget about that a little bit. So this neo-ichnology, this new ichnology and the new traces, I think, yeah, any information that we have on new stuff, I think should be applied to the ancient. So getting some of those trackers in, yeah, I've seen a couple of shows where they have some of the Aboriginal trackers, and they are just incredible.
Yeah.
And they are literally seeing kind of one broken blade of grass and using that to start tracking some animal that we wouldn't even see it. Where, you know, our eyes are not trained in, so we wouldn't see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to make a contribution?
I don't think so. I'm gonna have to. I'm losing my screen.
Right. Okay. Well,
getting back to the coprolites, this is just a little aside. When we were doing the exhibitions in Uxbridge, we usually have a stand there with coprolites in, and the kids love the dinosaur poo. And I was explaining it to the children, and one small child said to me, "Does it still smell?"
Well, maybe you can tell the kids that they actually found, they're certain they found T-Rex poop for the first time 2 years ago. That was here in Canada, in Saskatchewan. And the poop is about 3 feet long. And they found lots of like bones and things in it. So they're pretty sure it's from a T-Rex.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, is that something that they would say do a CT scan on it so they didn't destroy it, but they'd be able to find out what bones that were in it?
Yeah, I'm not sure what they did with that one. I think they actually did take a slice out of it, a very thin slice. So they did actually, I mean, yeah, you might not want to destroy it, but I think they took a slice to see what it looked like inside. Yeah. I find quite a lot of fish poops. They're very distinctive because they're yellow and they're quite small, and they always have bits of fish in them. So they're eating other bits of fish, and there's little bits of fish bone in them. And they're really quite distinctive. So you find them, they're just one of the fossils that you come across very commonly in these dinosaur-bearing deposits as a kind of extra fossil.
Is it possible to use the traces to understand changes in animal behavior over the millions of years? Or is that too you know, really beyond what the evidence will help?
Hey, you know, I think as geologists, we're the only reason we have a job in the first place is because there's so much uncertainty. If everything was known, then there'd be no need for geology. Yeah. So I think that's a lovely area of study, just to see, well, yeah, maybe I mean, simple things like if you looked at horse footprints through time, you start off with Eohippus with its little cat's eyes with its 4 hooves, and then you know, four-toed hoof, and then you go through to modern horses with their single digit. So I mean, you're going to see a huge change. So yeah, I see no reason why you shouldn't apply that to any other kind of trace fossil through time. There you are. You have a project now.
That's 2 you're giving us.
Can I ask, Jon, how you talk to people who are a bit skeptical about, especially about footprints, you know, dinosaur footprints? How do you explain how they could be preserved for such a long time?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I think footprints, they are one of those fossils that are everything from kind of sublime to ridiculous. So you get to the point where you're so uncertain yourself about whether they're a footprint or not. So I do think that, yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one with footprints, but you know, you try and get as much evidence as you can. So I usually start off with a depositional setting. So if you can get the setting right, you can say, right, we know we're in a river setting here. We know we're in the Cretaceous. So what are we going to see when we look around? You know, if we didn't see dinosaurs, that would be weird. We would expect to see them. So then if you kind of set the scene first and then start bringing the traces in as supporting evidence, then you've already kind of like got a foothold, you know, a beachhead that you can then work from. So yeah, people will always be dubious. And, you know, when I'm on field trips, I always get asked, you can think you know about geology, but you always get asked the questions you can't answer. So you end up sort of free associating anyway. So yeah, you can't always convince people, but you just have to do your best. But yeah, I think getting that depositional setting right to start off with, that really helps with then populating it with animals.
But a footprint is so ephemeral in our daily lives. They don't hang around for very long. So when you see one that's, you know, millions or tens of millions of years old, people don't tend to believe that it could possibly hang around for that long. What is it that makes them keep their shape over that amount of time?
There is a big school of thought, and this is something that geologists love kind of wallowing in, about that only the extraordinary is preserved, because the ordinary just gets washed away and gets, you know. So for example, if you look at a beach deposit, an ancient beach deposit, then that beach was there for tens of thousands of years. So why were the layers that you see preserved? And were they preserved because there was a sudden rise in sea level, or because the storm dumped a load of sediment on the beach? So are we actually seeing more of the extraordinary in the fossil record than the ordinary? So the day-to-day stuff just, yeah, it doesn't have much preservation potential. So my bird footprints, for example, from Borneo, the reason they were preserved is because there was a mud layer, and the mud layer, the animals made their footprints in the mud, and then some sand got washed across and it filled in those footprints. And then along that contact between the mud and the sand, ironstone came through, siderite, and the siderite cemented up the footprints. So they're actually cemented sand, the footprints, and that's how they were preserved. So that's a kind of extraordinary thing as well. So there were probably lots of footprints throughout there that just didn't get preserved, and or we can't see them because they're mud on mud, and there's only just this one horizon where we were lucky enough to see those footprints preserved. So yeah, maybe it's just the extraordinary that we're seeing.
Yeah,
that's really, really clear. Thanks. Good explanation.
Thanks.
any other comments or questions?
Yeah, Guy, I'm just going to come in with something just to finish off with in a way. It's with all the talk of coprolites. As a micropaleontologist, we come across loads of microscopic fecal pellets. We see them by the dozen in some levels, particularly in the mid-Cretaceous, where you get the glauconitized fecal pellets that you see, particularly in the sort of different levels within the lower chalk and the Gault clay. And it was my supervisor, Malcolm Hart, who took me to one side and showed me a glauconitized fecal pellet, and this could have been a fish sort of coprolite or a worm fecal pellet. We thought it was a fish, but what made us both, I don't know whether it was smile or cringe, was the fact that sticking out at 90 degrees through the fecal pellet was a sponge spicule. And you know, this just made your eyes water just to think about the poor thing having to pass this, pass this fecal pellet. And yet nevertheless, the sponge spicule was still preserved there, sticking out as the side of the fecal pellet. So you do find that, it's like you say, John, it's the oddities that get preserved.
Is this a bedtime story?
No, it's just one to make you cry.
Well, thanks for that. Right, well, I think we'll draw it to a close, at least the formal part of the session. John, thanks so much for your presentation, and there's a lot of interest in that, and I shall take away a few things myself. So I'll ask everybody to give you another round of applause.
Thank you.
Right, one last announcement for me, and then we can have just a free discussion. Our next meeting will be on the 14th of December, when Professor Daniel Shreve from the Royal Holloway, University of London, will be joining us, and her talk will be on Move, Adapt or Die, Ice Age Animals from Southwest Britain. That's the end of the formal part of the meeting. You can stay online and chat afterwards. Thanks so much.
Yes.